Anybody say anything?
Mm-mm.
You want to speak to them real quick to see if they can hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Good. Okay. All right. Excellent. Excellent. Greetings, everyone. This is Sundiata with Compost Community, and we are back at it with another wonderful set of information concerning the Farmers Market Promotion Program through the Frenchtown Neighborhood Improvement Association. And today we are going to take a little diversion away from the normal course of the curriculum that we've been on to sort of break the monotony just a tad bit. But we want to go a little bit deeper into what would be more of a benefit for farmers and ranchers. And we wanted to sort of expound upon the concepts and ideas and practices of compost and composting. So I'm going to jump back and forth between the curriculum and a PowerPoint presentation. Audrey will be able to share that on the screen so you all can follow along. And so I just wanted to put that caveat out there that we will be jumping back and forth between the curriculum that you all should have, as well as a PowerPoint presentation that Audrey will be able to share. Okay, all right, so the first thing we want to talk about is soil. So building soil is probably the most pertinent part of having a farm or having a ranch, because all of it relies on the microbiology in your soils, whether it's for growing fruits, vegetables, or raising livestock. You need that microbiology in the ground and in your soils. So compost is one way in which we can increase the ability for us to build our soils and add those extra nutrients for what we call nutrient cycling, which we'll get into a little bit later. So in this unit, we're going to take a deeper look into compost, soil structure, and how to mitigate disease in the soil. We'll first take a look at compost and the benefits of integrating compost into your system. So a little bit of background on compost. Compost is as old as civilization itself, as evidenced in the ancient writings of Kemet, which is ancient Egypt, Sumer, Samaria, Rome, and Greece. So you go back and actually do some Googling and do a little bit of research. They might not have called it compost in some of those empires and civilizations, but you'll go and read about the agricultural practices, and you'll find that there were methods that they had that that shows evidence that they recycled food, they recycled organic material to build up their soils. One of our most famous sort of modern day scholars of composting is a gentleman by the name of Sir Albert Howard. He's known as the father of compost, and he devised the Indori method of composting in the early 20th century. He did this in India. He went to India, and of course, Sir Albert Howard is a Britishman, and this was during the time when the British were a colonial power over the people of India, the subcontinent of India. So compost over the past 20 years has experienced a newfound interest among the general population. If you travel all over the United States, you'll find people and organizations ranging from backyard composters to neighborhood composting sites to larger community composting efforts up to commercially scaled composting facilities. This newfound interest has sparked conversations over what compost is, what it isn't, how to make it, what it's supposed to smell like, what the microbiology in it is supposed to look like, and all of these things. So many questions arise from people from a multitude of backgrounds trying to figure out how to make it, how to properly use it. So by definition, compost is the product manufactured through the controlled aerobic biological decomposition of biodegradable materials. The product has undergone mesophilic and thermophilic temperatures which significantly reduces the viability of pathogens and weed seeds and stabilizes the carbon such that it is beneficial for plant growth. So that is more of a modern, up-to-date definition of what compost is. Okay. So why do we compost? All right. So composting, there's a wide array of reasons why we partake in that in this amazing process. One of the main aspects of composting is to reduce waste. And it makes us less dependent on landfill, which we know landfills are a very detrimental component to our environment and to our soils. So compost application reduces erosion. It strengthens soils and contributes to healthy plant growth. Compost decreases greenhouse gases, and carbon sequestration takes place, where carbon or CO2 is removed from the atmosphere, placing it back into the soil in a viable way in which plants can use it and benefit. So when we talk about soil building, when people think about farming, they think about tilling, right? So when you till, you are breaking up the soil, whether it's compact or if it's clay. You're breaking it up to provide air into it and to bring in space. But what people don't realize is that when you till, you also harm the microbiology that's in the soil. And so when you do that, you're actually releasing carbon from the soil. And that's not a good thing. We don't want to allow that carbon to be released from the soil into the atmosphere. What we want to do is reverse that process. We want to sequester carbon. We want to remove CO2 from the atmosphere and put it back into the soil. That is the most important aspect, or one of the most important aspects with compost in regards to climate change and altering the climate condition that we currently face. So, Audrey, let's jump to the PowerPoint really quick. How we doing, people? How's it going? Excellent. All right, glad to see y'all. So what is soil? All right, so we mentioned a little bit about what compost is, but compost is created by nature and by human to add to the soil, to be an amendment to the soil. But the soil itself, what is it? So soil is the upper layer of earth in which plants grow, a black or dark brown material, typically consisting of a mixture of organic remains, clay, rock particles, sand, silt, clay, rock. All of those things can typically make up a soil or a soil profile. Soil, also commonly referred to as earth or dirt, is a mixture of organic matter, minerals, gases, liquids, and organisms that together support life. So all of those particles that exist in what we consider soil can stand alone, or they can all actually act in conjunction with one another to help create pockets of air to allow oxygen to flow through the soil, create habitats for microbiology to live on, and allow this nutrient cycling to take place between carbon, nitrogen, various forms of nitrogen such as nitrate and ammonium. And so so all of those particles within a soil layer, if coupled with the proper microbiology, can act in a type of synergy that allows nutrients to continue to flow, and it allows a food web to continue to flow that eventually allows those nutrients to be readily available for your plants or trees. Okay. So let us move on So we already talked about what compost is. We gave the updated definition of compost that the United States Composting Council has put out. And if you all have not visited the United States Composting Council's website, please do so. For those that are online, write that down. It's USCC, the United States Composting Council. And you'll see these updated definitions. You'll also see various papers and studies and research that have been done over the past 10, 15, 20 years on composting, on soils, on the benefits of compost extract, compost teas, the liquid amendments. And you could also join the United States Composting Council. And there are benefits that come along with being a member. You get discounts on their annual conferences, discounts on different trainings and things of that nature. So it's the United States Composting Council. All right, so what are we trying to do when we create compost? We're trying to create this web, what we call the soil food web. Okay, and the soil food web is like a food chain inside of compost and inside of soil. So the soil food web shows us the prey and predator relationship that takes place inside of compost and the soil. So this is an example of the soil food web. So it's very simple. And the diagram, I know you see all those lines, you probably think like, oh Lord, what's this crazy web taking place? But it's very simple. So we start all the way to the left of the diagram. That's what we call our first trophic level. So the trophic level is the very first level at which a system or process is beginning to allow all of the other levels to ensue, to allow those other levels to take place. And so on the left, you'll see the sun up in the sky. You'll see the plants and the roots in the ground. And underneath that, you'll see organic matter. So this first trophic level that's taking place is photosynthesis. All right, we're taught that in elementary and middle school, all the way up through college, what photosynthesis is. And as you got older and you matriculated through your educational experience, we should have been told a little bit more about what processes take place when photosynthesis actually occurs. Because in elementary and middle school, we're just told that photosynthesis is the way plants make their own food. And that was like it. That's all I can remember from that time of my childhood. It's the way plants make food. But when you go a little bit deeper, you see how the plant actually produces the first level of microbial activity that is to take place inside of the soil. So what happens is the plant absorbs the sunlight. In the root systems of the plant, sugars and carbohydrates are created. So, and it's put out or released through the root systems of those plants as exudates, right? Carbs, sugars, signals that the plant root is putting out to signal that, hey, we need something or some organism to come and consume these carbs, carbohydrates, and these sugars. So here come the bacteria, the fungi, and what these organisms do, they come in and they begin to consume the organic material that's being released in the form of carbs and sugars by the roots of the plant. So those fungi come in, they're consuming that organic matter. Bacteria come in, they're consuming that organic matter. And when you go a little bit deeper into the fungi and bacterial relationship, you'll find that these organisms, these microorganisms, sometimes they work independently, but a lot of times you'll find bacteria housing itself inside the hyphae of fungi. And there's this symbiotic relationship taking place between the two that a lot of mycologists and people who study fungi are still trying to figure out what that relationship is. And so that's the second trophic level, is when you have these decomposing organisms such as bacteria and fungi come in and begin consuming that organic matter being released from the roots of the plant. The next trophic level, here comes the nematodes and the protozoa and the microarthropods. And these organisms are actually feeding on the fungi, the bacteria. You have fungi and bacteria feeding nematodes, and the protozoa, which are known as amoeba, flagellates, and ciliates. These organisms feed on the bacteria and the fungi, and then they actually excrete waste. And it is the waste from the nematodes and the protozoa primarily that are nutrients that are then absorbed around or absorbed from the roots of the plants or by the roots of the plants. So imagine, especially those first like 3 or 4 levels, all of this activity is happening around the root system of a plant. So we've hit that third trophic level, and then it just keeps going higher and higher and higher and creating this food chain or this food web that you see. So the fourth trophic level is going to be higher arthropods, larger nematodes, and all of these organisms just feed on the previous level. And again, it's that third and fourth trophic level that really provide the nutrients for those plants in the form of waste. Okay? So the soil food web just illustrates the process by which nutrient cycling takes place. This is how soils maintain their ability to provide nutrients for plants to uptake through their root systems. All right, so this is very important. So this diagram that you see actually shows us the stages of succession. So when we talk about succession, we're talking about the building up of plant material. So if you look at the arrows on the bottom of that diagram, you'll see to the left, you have bacteria-dominated soil. And as you move to the right, you have more fungi-dominated soil. So in a bacterial-dominated soil, you have just kind of like grasses, annual weeds, some perennials, blueberries, it could be blackberry vines. And the higher you go up to then shrubs. So we're talking, any type of native shrub, azaleas, these perennials that come back every year and that actually fruit like a flower. The higher you go up that ladder, you begin to see more fungi in the soil. So you begin to see a higher fungi to bacteria ratio. And then the higher you go up, you go into different types of trees. It could be fruit trees. It could be pines. It could be like a young forest. And then you continue to go up into like your beech and maple, old forest, redwoods. You'll find scientists have found extremely dominant and prolific fungal networks that exist at the root level of these trees and in these forests. So prolific that the fungi that is operating between the root systems of these trees and these forests actually are connected to one another, and they can communicate with one another. So if there's a tree that's sitting in that's in that hyphal network, that fungi network, and it doesn't have the proper nutrients, or it's not receiving the proper nutrients, those trees through that mycelium network can actually communicate and send resources and send nutrients to that tree that's lacking. So the mycelium network is sort of like your earthly, your very first super information highway, where communications can actually take place between living entities. Okay. So again, just another sort of way to visually see the different types of plants and their relationship to a bacterial dominated soil versus a fungi mycelium dominated soil. So again, annual weeds, perennials, plants, grasses, and then as you go up the stages of succession, shrubs, softwood trees, hardwood trees become more dominant in fungi. All right, so this is a very important part in terms of actually creating and managing your own compost. And so when you are going through the composting process, it's quite simple just in terms of what's needed, but you have to monitor and manage the composting process in order to produce the best product that you're looking for that will benefit your garden, benefit your orchard, and not bring in or promote disease amongst your plants and trees. So what you have to pay attention to is the temperatures of your compost pile. And the only way to be able to take a temperature of a compost pile is you need a thermometer. And so the temperatures that you're looking for are between 131 and 160 up to maybe 165 degrees Fahrenheit. This process is known as PFRP, the process to further reduce pathogen. And taking the temperature as well as checking for moisture, which you want at 50%, is critical for quality manufacturing of compost. And what compost ultimately does is it aids in the building of the structure of your soil. All right, so really quick, let me jump back to the curriculum. I just want to see if we can align, and I know most of y'all have the curriculum. We talked about the food web. All right, so Audrey, we can go to the curriculum real quick on soil structure, number 2 in the book. So soil structure is highly critical for crop production. So what is it that allows soils to be structured properly to allow airflow, to allow for it to be porous enough, to allow root systems to penetrate and not get suffocated and caught up in very small porous systems that will suffocate that root and not allow it to breathe and expand and do what it does, go out and search for nutrients. So it's the microbiology that is primarily, or that is the responsible party for having good soil structure. So the bacteria and the fungi actually help to create the right type of soil structure for plants to thrive. So bacteria helps to create glues that bind certain particulars in the soil, forming what we call micro aggregates. And fungi, the hyphae, which are the long stringy aspects of the long stringy parts of a fungal network, wrap themselves around all of the micro aggregates, thereby creating macro aggregates. And these formations help to build and maintain structure of the soil. So a good structure has porosity and channels large enough for water to percolate through at the right speed, allowing for moisture absorption by the plant roots and for oxygen to move throughout the soil as well. So as seen in this diagram, a well-structured soil facilitates air flow, water flow. And remember, when water is flowing, it needs to flow at the right rate, slow enough for the plant roots to be able to pick up the moisture as the water moves through it. Yes, Audrey.
That's not the same. That's on here.
Oh, hold on, let me go. Are we looking at that? Yep, okay. All right, so this is a conceptual diagram of what the structure will look like in your soil. So look at the key, look at all of the micro aggregates, right? Those are the oval shape and the circular shape components, right? Those are bacteria. That is you know, plant and fungal debris. You got silt and small clay aggregates, all part of that. And basically that is the bacteria that is sort of, the bacteria are gluing and holding all of those things together. The big orange part, that is the plant root, right? So you look, and this is just giving you an idea as to all of the activity that's taking place around the roots of a plant or a tree. Okay. All right, and the green strands, if you look at your key, that is your mycorrhizal fungi hyphae. So those green strands are actually holding all of those micro aggregates together that we talked about. So your bacteria are sort of acting as a glue to bring all of the sand, silt, rock, clay, pebble together in an aggregate form. And then it is the hyphae of the fungi, the mycorrhizal fungi, that move throughout and shape and cover and hold all of those micro aggregates together, creating that macro aggregate. Okay, so you're going to have organic matter around the root systems of a plant. You have it all, and you have, you know, space in between the macro aggregate to allow, again, airflow, and for when water flows through. Imagine water hitting, coming down the which direction you want to see that as a vertical route. Water moving through those spaces, through those fungal spaces and those hyphal spaces of that aggregate. It has to move around and sort of kind of, you know, come down at the different directions, and all of that microbial activity and that microbiology is allowing the water to percolate at the right sort of timing to allow the root system to absorb that moisture. So just imagine water sort of trickling through that system. So this is a good visual diagram of a macro aggregate. So this is what happens. This is what's forming around the roots of your plant. And if any of you all are gardeners and have garden, you'll know that, like, say there's a plant that has expired in the field or in your backyard garden, you want to go pick it up or you know, pull it out and discard it or compost it. 9 times out of 10, if you have decent soil structure and your plant has grown fairly well during that season, you pull up that collard green plant, all of the root system is going to be holding all of that soil in place. So this is what's holding all of that soil in place around that root system. It's that microbiology. It's those glues. And then what do you do? You don't want to just take that plant with all of that soil attached to those roots and toss it. You want to shake that plant to get all of that soil to fall back down into the soil, because that you want to keep that. You don't want to discard that. That's all life. That's all microbiology. Okay. All right. What's next on the page on y'all's curriculum?
Disease and pathogen mitigation.
Disease and pathogen. Okay. All right. But here, look at this picture really quick. This is an example of fungal hyphae. Like all of those white strands. Those white strands are actually holding all of these. This is almost like this is some compost and a lot of wood chips. And that fungal network is really holding all of that together. And that picture's in the book, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So that's a very serious picture. And when your compost or your soil has this fungal network, you know that there's a lot of great microbial activity taking place, a lot of nutrient cycling going on. Let me just see what's left on. Okay. What's next on the curriculum?
Disease and pathogen mitigation.
Okay. So before we move on to number 3, I want to look at this another critical part of soil building. And many people, when you talk about building soil and building soil structure, you know, the talk and the things that are typically used are compost, manure, right? Cow manure, horse manure, chicken manure. These things do add nitrogen. They add certain elements back into the soil to assist with plant production. But a less talked about form of natural technology is what we call cover crops. So cover crops are things that you plant in your soil when you're actually allowing your soil to rest. So you may not be producing your cash crop, your greens, your tomatoes, your sweet potatoes, you know, your peas, your beans. You might want to allow that field or that plot to rest for a little bit. But what you don't want to do is just leave your soil bare. If you leave your soil bare, think about it. When we talked about the first trophic level of the soil food web, what was it? It was photosynthesis, which means that you got to have plants in the ground in order for that plant to absorb that sunlight and create that microbial activity. So a lot of people make the mistake of allowing their fields to rest by just leaving it bare. But when you leave it bare, erosion, weatherization, rain, and all these things will come down, hit that soil, wash away those nutrients, wash away the structure of the soil, and you'll be left to sort of start over again. So cover crops are different types of crops where you have grasses, legumes, and brassicas. And each one of these categories plays sort of a different role in the soil. Grasses like sorghum, Sudan grass, barley, oat, wheat, triticale. That's you know, some of our more popular grasses. These things provide biomass. So we're talking, you know, the amount of green that grows from the soil will be, you know, we're talking a lot of organic matter that will grow from those grasses. And that organic matter can then be crimped, which they use like a machinery, a piece of machinery with a wheel, almost like a steamroller, to just kind of go in and sort of fold the grass down. It's not that they're not cutting it, they're not pulling it up from the ground, they're just kind of crimping it. And what happens is it actually sort of dies to a certain extent. And then once that grass is laying down on the soil, the bacteria and the microbiology will come up and begin to decompose that material and allowing all of those nutrients to kind of seep back into the soil. Some farmers will cut those grasses and actually till them in to the soil. But remember earlier we talked about we want to move away from tilling, because when we till, we actually release carbon from our soils and we kill and hurt and basically destroy the microbiology that's in the soil when you do too much tilling. And so those are some of the benefits of grasses. Legumes like clover, cowpeas, black-eyed peas, hairy vetch. A lot of these a lot of leguminous cover crops actually fix nitrogen into the soil. So they'll take atmospheric nitrogen through their plant, their leaves and whatnot, and they'll plant that nitrogen and fixate it into the soil and creating a form of nitrogen that's readily available for plant usage. And so that's a great, because all plants, all cash crops, especially, you know, all plants that you grow, whether it be food, you know, blueberries, different types of trees, they require certain levels of nitrogen. And so when you plant those that cover crop, the leguminous cover crop, you actually are creating nitrogen fixation in your soil. And the way in which you can tell that nitrogen is actually being fixated in your soil is if you grow something like a black-eyed pea or a cowpea, or you grow a type of clover. When you pull that system up out of the ground, that plant, you'll see these little nodules on the root systems. And those nodules can either be white or they can be pink. When those nodules are pink, that lets you know that nodule has like accumulated enough nitrogen, atmospheric nitrogen, into its root that will then be released as nitrogen for other plants to use. So those nodules have to be pink, and that is a visual indicator that it has absorbed enough nitrogen and is ready to be sort of released into the soils utilized by that following crop or that cash crop that you're going to plant after you plant your cover crop. And you also have brassicas, which are mustards and like radishes. So mustards have these chemical signals that actually move throughout the soil and prevent certain insects from coming and destroying that plant, right? Or a mustard plant on its foliage can attract certain insects, acting as a trap crop, leaving other crops alone. So sometimes you can plant like purple mustards all around your garden space, and certain insects will be attracted to that plant alone and leave your other crops alone. So you can use it as a trap crop to trap those insects. Radishes like daikon radish or Japanese radish, these radishes can grow, up to 3 to 6 feet and I'm sorry, about 1 to 2 feet in length, providing pores within the soil. They can actually grow like these large holes in clay soil, breaking up the soil, allowing airflow to take place to allow plants to be able to grow a little bit better. All right. So cover crops are a great way to help build up your soils. If you don't have access to a lot of compost, you can use cover crops. All right, so we're going to move into disease and pathogen mitigation. So a well-structured soil with the right microbiology will create a condition in the soil to kill off or outcompete bad bacteria. If the soil is healthy and teeming with microbes, then the plants will perform in a much more efficient manner, creating a system of nutrient cycling, as I previously mentioned. So healthy microbial-rich soils help to keep plants healthy and don't allow for plants to get sick. A sick plant will send off a chemical signal to insects and pests that it is ready to be consumed. That is basically saying that it's not worthy to be in the garden. Please come eat me up. So these are actual signals that these plants are putting out. So there are many factors to building a healthy soil. So again, the continuous adding of compost, those cover crops, and you want, or manures, and you at some point in time, you want to be able to test your organic matter percentage of your soils and have a minimum of 3% organic matter. That is the minimum for having the right environment for nutrient cycling to take place, for that right structure to be there, and for plants to be able to grow healthy. So if you ever wanted to get your soil tested, you can do that and see if that test checks for the soil organic matter, and you want at least 3% organic matter. So that's one indicator of healthy soil. The high temperatures when making compost kills off pathogens. Afterwards, the properly managed compost is added to the native soil, and good microbiology moves in to resist and defeat pathogens that might be lingering in the soil. This is why soil building can easily take 1 to 2 years of consistent adding of organic matter in the form of compost or utilization of cover crops. All right, and you want to keep doing that until you reach that desired percentage of 3%. There are farms in our areas that have been adding compost for years, and they're up to like 6, 7, 8, 9, 10% organic matter. And that's unheard of in most farms, especially conventional farms across the United States. And so the only way to get that minimum organic matter is to add organic matter time and time and time again until you reach that threshold. Let's see where we are. Where are we? So real quick, I also want to mention, you got a question?
Yeah.
Yes.
How would a wood chip fit into this? I guess even for you, have you experienced know some people who deal with wood chips, and how is that experience?
Yeah, so he asked about wood chips and how do they fit into building healthy soil. So wood chips are a carbon source, right? So we can use wood chips in a few different ways. As a composter, you need a 30-to-1 ratio of carbon to nitrogen when you make compost, right? When you build a compost pile. And so wood chips being heavy carbon, you're usually going to have about 65 to 70% of a carbon source to 10 and 20%. These are two different categories, but 10% high nitrogen and 20% sort of regular nitrogen, food scraps, things of that nature. So that's a necessity when we're making good compost. You've got to have that ratio of, again, 20 up to 30-to-1 carbon to nitrogen when you're making compost. Now, if you're just taking wood chips and you're using it as a mulch, right? You can take those wood chips and you can spread that out over however much area that you want to. And what's going to happen over time. Now, that, again, soil building takes time, right? So if you just use wood chips and you spread them out over however much space you're looking to grow on, within 6 to 12 months, you can go back to those same wood chips, dig a little bit, and you'll see all of this mycelium fungi moving and doing what it can to break all of that wood material down. So those wood chips are going to provide a healthy benefit and an added level of nutrition to your soil, just because fungi breaks that down. The bacteria can try to work at wood chips as well, but it's the fungi specifically that's going to really break that material down in a much more faster rate and allow for that, that carbon to just go back into the soil slowly. And so you can lay wood chips over an area, wait a year, and then if you want to plant, you can come and just kind of move the wood chips from around that area that you want to put a plant in, and that area is going to be teeming with microbes, with mycelium fungi. So wood chips play an important role in building soil. It's just, it will take a little bit of time if you just spread it out over the area. So this book here is through the USDA SARE office, the Southern Agricultural Research Education Office. And you can get a lot of these books for free. They have a lot of different books, crop rotation, managing cover crops profitably. So this book is really going into all of the different types of cover crops that exist, from your grasses, legumes, to brassicas. And they show you how to integrate these cover crops into your system, to where not only can that cover crop add benefit to your soil, but you may be able to harvest that cover crop and actually generate income from it. So if you look at that picture of the woman to your left, those are daikon radishes. So you see how large they get, and they can get larger than that. They get longer than that and thicker than that. They have a much thicker diameter, a larger diameter, and more length. And what happens is, again, those radishes push down into compacted soils, specifically clay. They're really good to help break up clay. And now you have a hole, a 6-inch or even a 12-inch hole in your soil that you can then use to, that airflow is now allowed to happen in that space. But you can also harvest those radishes and sell them. You can sell them to restaurants. You can sell them to, at the farmer's market. You sell them through whatever venue that you sell through. So just kind of going back to the different venues that we talked about in units 3 and 4, concerning ways to generate revenue. This is all tied in, right? Whether it be value-added products that we're looking to create, and usually value-added products are created from food that farmers are growing or that you're growing yourself. So knowing how to keep a soil healthy, knowing how to keep your pasture healthy. When we talk about livestock, cattle, sheep, goat, different ruminants, if that pasture doesn't get the right microbiology, those ruminants will eat through that pasture as quickly as they can, and you might have some type of rotational grazing system where you rotate those animals from acre to acre to acre to acre, and and however many weeks you come back around to that first acre. If you don't have the right microbiology in your soil, by the time those animals come back around to that first paddock or that first plot, your grasses haven't grown to where they need to be in order for those animals to eat sufficiently. Okay, so cover cropping, soil building, proper microbiology all plays into what farmers do, what ranchers do. And then those items are then what? Turned into additional products or sold on the market as fresh products. So all of these things are tied in. That's why this unit was sort of specifically geared towards the farmer and the rancher, right? We got to be able to keep our soils fertile. Okay, so what I want to do is quickly jump back to the PowerPoint. All right, we talked about the macro aggregate, the good fungal hyphate. All right, so really quick, if you're interested in producing compost, these are just some basic tips. All right, so you have to start with a base of carbon material, right? We mentioned that carbon material is wood chips, leaves, carbon fines. Carbon fines are when they take just tree stumps, wood chips, and they run them through a grinder that has a very fine screen, and so that material comes out almost looking like soil. It's so fine that it looks like soil, but it's not soil. It's just those tree branches ground up into that material or that consistency. But you can also integrate those into your compost pile, which we have access to that material here in Leon County, specifically at the solid waste dump. You can actually drive out there and have them load up regular coarse wood chips, the chunkier stuff, or these carbon fines. They'll come out with a bulldozer, dump a yard or two on the back of your truck, and you take that home to use. So you got to start with a nice thick layer of carbon material, leaves, wood chips, or those carbon fines. So we're talking 2, 3, 4 inch thick layer. All right. And then you add your nitrogen material. So we're talking coffee grounds, eggshells, fruit scraps, veggie scraps, all of that type of stuff. And we actually compost meat sometimes as well. We have some restaurants that cook like octopus, and every now and again we'll get a compost bucket and we dump it, and we see this gooey, nasty looking thing, and I'm like, what the heck is that? But it's an actual like octopus head. So again, you take that material, you put it in the middle of this compost pile, the bacteria are going to just eat that thing up because you provide the right ingredients and components for a compost pile. You water it, you mix it well. Those bacteria are going to reproduce at alarming rates, right? They're going to mimic themselves and reproduce 10 times over just within a matter of 30 minutes. And so upon building a compost pile, 24 hours go by, you've already reached your temperature range, or what we call that PFRP, that process to reduce further pathogens. Okay, so you want to mix your nitrogen materials and your carbon materials very well. You want to turn your pile at least once a week if you're just kind of doing it on a passive level. You want to water lightly as you turn. When you first built your pile, you want to water it heavily, okay? Because the microbiology needs moisture and they need air. They need airflow and moisture. And so that's why you water heavily, and the bacteria are going to utilize and start absorbing all of that moisture and absorbing the oxygen that's inside of that pile. That's why we make compost with thick wood chips. right? So we're mixing in all of this material, food scraps, coffee grounds, thicker wood chips. Those wood chips allow airflow to move in through the pile. Now what happens is the bacteria are inside that pile consuming all of the oxygen. They need that oxygen and that air to be able to do the work that they do, to reproduce, to decompose this material. And so while you build a pile, a day later, you see that you've reached your 131, 135, 145 temperature range. You checking those temperatures, by day like 4 or 5, you'll start to see those temperatures begin to drop. Why? It's because the bacteria are utilizing more oxygen and more moisture inside that pile than air that is flowing into the pile. So the rate that they're consuming the oxygen is greater than the rate of oxygen that's flowing into that pile. That's why if you meet your PFRP temperature for at least 3 days, they say flip it, open your pile up and turn it. Because if you leave it for longer than those 3 days, the temperatures will go down, oxygen use is, or oxygen availability is being reduced, and then other conditions can begin to set inside of your pile. So this process is known as aerobic, oxygen loving. But if they're using up all of the oxygen and we're not opening that pile up after 3 or 4 days to allow more oxygen, to allow them to breathe, then what happens to the levels of oxygen? They begin to deplete. As we end up moving from an aerobic situation to an anaerobic situation, which is without oxygen, right? And then anaerobic conditions breed pathogens, and anaerobic bacteria are not what we want to be promoting and creating while we're building the compost pile. So you see your ideal temperature range, 145 to 150. So again, that range is like 131 all the way up to about 160. So the reason why that's the ideal temperature range is because think about a spectrum. All the way on the 131 side, you have a certain type of bacteria, a little bit more cooler, right? All the way on the 160 to 165 side, they're much more hot. But if you have that middle range, then what you end up having is a more of a wider diversity of bacteria. And that's why that middle temperature range is ideal, because you get a little bit of the bacteria from the entire spectrum from both sides, and you get a much more diversity. And so we want diversity inside of our compost pile when we're talking about the different forms of bacteria that exist in there. Keep all food covered to avoid flies and rodents. And dump your compost when you get it. Don't let it sit in your buckets or sit in containers or sit on your kitchen counter for more than a day or two. You really want to collect it and then dump it into your bin or your standalone compost pile. So we talked about this. We talked about oh yes.
So Robin had a question. She said, so if it gets too hot, is that where the mold or E. coli comes from?
If it gets too hot, no. Those hot temperatures are actually removing and killing off all pathogens, all bad bacteria, bad pathogens, anything, weed seeds, anything that we don't want inside our compost, anything that's undesirable. Those high temperatures will kill off all of those things. What we want to be mindful of is that, again, we want that mid temperature range, right? So if it's too hot, then you may not need to leave your pile for 3 days, because it's the center of the pile that's being heated up due to the biological activity. So if that pile gets up to 160, 165, even 170, you don't have to leave the pile for 3 days like our instructions told us. So let's go back to that one real quick. So that ideal temperature range, if you hit that range, you can leave that pile sitting for 3 days and then you turn it, right? But if our pile is at 160, then it's been hotter. It's been much more hotter on the inside of the pile. So you don't have to leave the pile there as long as you would with lower temperatures. So if that pile heats up to 160, 165 in a day, you can let that thing sit for maybe 2 days and then you can turn it, right? So the high temperatures are actually beneficial. They're letting us know that the bad bacteria, disease, pathogens are being mitigated and controlled and outcompeted within that compost pile. All right. Did that help with the question? And who was that from?
That was from
No, well, I'm still trying to figure out where the E. coli comes from.
Well, okay, when you're talking about E. coli, like on a farm,
Yeah.
okay, those usually come from humans.
Okay, so it's not something that was introduced to the soil.
It can be introduced to the soil. So like there have been many times where lettuce has been recalled, right?
Right.
Right. And so that lettuce will have E. coli, the E. coli outbreak. That is usually from a foreign or outside entity that brought that E. coli in, and then it proliferated throughout the plants, and it can be introduced into the soils, but it won't grow and proliferate as much throughout the soil as it would jumping from plant to plant. But it's usually brought in from an outside party, a foreign party, and usually that's human. So one of the stories that I had come across a few years back were migrant workers picking, different types of produce in certain fields. And they didn't have adequate bathroom conditions. They weren't allowed to take a certain amount of time to go to the bathroom because they're out in the fields. So if they have to relieve themselves in the field, that is a way in which disease can actually be spread in that scenario.
Okay.
So so that's an example of what happens when there's an E. coli outbreak amongst produce. It is brought in from an outside entity.
So animal waste, like, because chickens, I'm sure they pee in the field. So animal waste doesn't produce that. Or manure doesn't produce that.
If it's composted, it doesn't. Usually chickens produce much of their manure inside the chicken coop, and when they're pooping outside of the chicken coop, normally you kind of keep chickens limited into a certain area, or if you let them free range, they're doing enough scratching and digging around that they're actually, it's not like there's a concentration of chicken manure just kind of sitting in one area. They actually move their own manure around as they forage in a particular area.
Okay.
And cow manure is different because of the many digestive systems that they have, all of the different stomach chambers. Cow manure is as clean of a manure as can be, because all of that manure or all of that grass that they've eaten has gone through so many different chambers that you can almost take cow manure, let it dry out, and then you can plant a seed in it.
Okay.
So cow manure is actually like revered as divine in certain countries because of its ability to add fertility, so much fertility back to the field. It's horse manure that you kind of have to be careful with, because they give horses a lot of antibiotics, and a lot of and that medicine will end up, being passed through the manure. So the manure is fine, usually from all ruminants and all animals, but you want to have a system where that manure is kind of trampled into the soil, or it's composted. So if they're just out in the field moving about, usually the animals themselves will trample that manure into the soil, and the microbiology will then come up, from the soil and begin to break all of that material down. You're not going to have cows and goats and sheep and chickens moving throughout your tomatoes or moving throughout your watermelon patch or your lettuces or your greens. So you see, so so we end up keeping those things separate But if the animals are defecating in just a field, like a pasture,
Mm-hmm.
and that manure has an opportunity to settle and be consumed by the microbiology, then we're good to go.
Okay. Thank you.
Oh, you're welcome. You're welcome. All right. So, any other questions? We're actually going to wrap it up in just a few minutes. Any other questions online or in the audience? Okay. All right. Wonderful. So we're going to wrap it up in just a minute, talking about the climate game changer. So carbon sequestration, again, is the process of capturing carbon from the air, primarily through plant photosynthesis, as we mentioned before. It provides nutrients for the soil while reducing carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. And what that does, again, we take that source of carbon that's not good for our atmosphere, place it back into the soil in a readily available form that plants can use for their benefit. Composting contributes to this process, so it leads to a buildup of soil organic carbon, or reduction in the rate at which organic matter is depleted from soil. So composting helps to switch that rate around. You know, the rate at which organic matter is being depleted through tillage, heavy tillage, right? Bare fields. Adding compost can reduce that rate. It can shrink that rate or slow down the rate at which we're losing that organic matter. So carbon sequestration, again, is critical to climate change. And you're beginning to see that. Recently, the United States Department of Agriculture just released their Composting and Food Waste Reduction Act, which is they put out $9.4 billion in grants to municipalities and cities to come up with innovative and creative composting and waste reduction or food recovery plans for their city. So there's a lot of money out there to actually move into this food recovery or composting avenue, and they know that composting is a game changer when it comes to climate change. If we were to take compost or even the microbiology from liquid compost, right? Say we took compost, made a liquid amendment. We take all of that microbiology and we spray it onto fields all across the United States, rebuilding that biology, removing those harmful chemicals and those harmful metals from the soils, then the microbiology with the plants growing, we begin to remove all of this CO2 from the atmosphere. Because you got to remember, when those commercial agricultural operations are done with their corn crop and they're getting ready for their soybean crop, what do? They come with these massive machines. We're talking about a machine as big as this room, with all of these blades stretching, 3, 4, 5 feet into the ground, just digging up the soil. Every time they do that, they're releasing carbon and they're killing off all of the microbiology inside the soil. And that helps it, and actually creates compaction. And that's why they have to come back every year to dig it up again. And when you dig it up every year, you're losing your biology, you're losing your life. And if you lose your life in your soil, then you lose what we refer back to as that nutrient cycling, or the cycling of nutrients. And if you lose the ability to cycle nutrients through that food web, then what do we have to add in order to keep food growing? What do we have to add? Fertilizers. And these fertilizers are synthetic. They are chemically based. And because there's no life in the soil, you're going to have weeds and different types of fungi that begins to grow up in your fields because there's no life helping to balance out and mitigate the negative effects of these other living entities. And so now you got to put fungicides down on your soil, herbicides to kill other types of weeds, and it's like, again, the pesticides, all of these sides, right? You think of it, side. What does side mean? Homicide. You get what I'm saying? So, and all of these things are salt-based, right? And salt actually prevents soil from being able to hold moisture. And remember when we looked at that aggregate image, that conceptual diagram, that aggregate, we want water to do what? Percolate slowly through those aggregates so that plant roots can receive that moisture and absorb it. But we're adding these fungicides and these pesticides and these herbicides to our soils. Those salts actually remove and separate the molecules that actually make up water. It begins to remove those things. So it's actually depleting the ability for water to move throughout these plant systems and these plant roots. Okay, so very, 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 very important. Just another image here of the benefits of compost. You see, if you're adding compost, you have greater plant growth. From the diagram on the right, you have greater plant growth. You're not losing CO2. You're actually pulling CO2 back into the soil, and that's the sequestration that we talked about. So really quick, in conclusion, there are many factors to building healthy soil. The most important is the continuous addition of organic matter in the form of compost. In order for a soil to be declared healthy, it must be tested and analyzed for at least 3% organic matter. This is one indicator of healthy soil. The high temperatures when making compost kills off pathogens, weed seeds, and afterwards, the properly managed and monitored compost is added to the native soil, and good microbiology moves in to resist and defeat any pathogens that might be lingering in the soil. This is why soil building can easily take 1 to 2 years of consistent adding of organic matter in the form of compost to reach the desired organic matter percentage. So I'm going to stop there. And, any other questions or comments about what we've discussed this evening? When this particular audio is uploaded on YouTube, share that with people that you know that are growing food, people that are trying to get into livestock production. This is what will save them, their families, their businesses, and ultimately what we feel and truly believe will save our planet is getting the microbiology and the life back into our soils so the soils can do the work that they were designed to do. All right, we will conclude there. So any questions? Anybody got anything to say?
I got a question. This is Robin again. The water, the water like that comes from the city. I don't know if all agricultural places get the same quality of water as you would drinking water, but does anything in the drinking water affect the fluoride that they put in there? Does anything in the drinking water affect plant growth in a negative way?
Yeah, actually it does. Municipal water is, I mean, it's laden with antimicrobial properties, right? It's they don't want microbes to grow, and so they use chlorine and another substance similar to it called chloramine. And so when you start growing, if you ever grown anything, you'll see a dramatic difference when you go out and you water. You can water for 5 minutes on a nice little patch of veggies that you grow. You're not going to readily see any difference over the next couple of days or week. But if it rains and that rain gets into those, the root systems of those plants, you can see a difference in the growth of those plants in 2 or 3 days, because rains are bringing, different elements, and it's not coming with those antimicrobial properties. It's not coming with the chlorine and the chloramine. It's bringing nitrogen into it. It's bringing oxygen into it. It's bringing these various elements from the water cycle that it picked up along the way through the water cycle, and now coming down in the form of precipitation, rain, and whatever those elements are that are in rain are now going into your soils, and the plants are just picking up on those things. So yes, municipal and city water does play a role in how well your plants can grow. It's not going to stop your plants can grow because it is water, right? And those levels are actually levels that they say are good enough for us to be able to drink. And they say Tallahassee water is supposedly one of the best water sources in the country, but definitely in the state of Florida, because of our aquifer system and our springs. But the water and our plants need water, so we have to pull from municipal sources. But if you have well water, you know, on your property, then you don't have to worry about that stuff. But yeah, city water coming through that processing facility, water treatment facility plants. Yes, we're getting water that has chlorine and chloramine in it, and who knows what other things in it. So they don't hurt the plants, but they don't necessarily promote the plant growth the way rainwater or well water does.
Okay.
Great
Appreciate
question,
that
though.
answer.
Great
Thank you.
Yes, ma'am.
I'm done.
Do we have any other questions? Do you all have any questions?
Anything?
All right, great. Well, if we have no other questions, we're gonna wrap up. Thank you all so much for joining us today, and be on the lookout in your email. You will receive a post-workshop survey. So we do want to hear back from you so we can make sure moving forward, we're able to cater to your needs and the things that you want to learn about through this program. And also make sure you know you're spreading this program by word of mouth. We will be uploading this recording onto the Frenchtown Neighborhood Improvement Association YouTube within the next few days, probably by Monday or Tuesday.
Thank you both. This is wonderful.
Thank you.
All right, thank you. Y'all have a great
All
evening.
right, good night. You too.